Okay, so maybe we'll start with a word of prayer, and then we'll begin. Father God, we thank you for this opportunity to study this topic, a very important topic of anxiety and the next generation especially, but it impacts all of us. And whether it's because we have relationships with the next generation or because this technology, the social media, and everything that we're going to talk about also affects us. So Father, I pray that you'll give us knowledge and wisdom through this cultural exegesis that we're about to do. And also I pray that you'll give us humility and a gracious attitude as we engage with this very important, but also what could be a very emotional and personal experience as we walk this together. I pray that you'll give a lot of love and grace in this room, and I pray that your Spirit will lead us. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. So the next 4 classes, because I know there's a lot of educators in this room, teachers, EAs, ex-teachers, retired EAs. We have 4 sessions. Tonight we'll be exegeting culture. If you're not used to like the biblical lingo of exegesis, we're gonna try to understand and interpret what culture is doing right now and what's happening in our culture. Next session will be about being present, the next one being focused, the next one being rested. These are all topics that Jonathan Haidt will talk about in his book, but also it's going to be a biblical response. You are at a church at the end of the day, so of course we're going to talk about the Bible and how we can respond to the cultural phenomenon that's happening all around us. Okay, and for the actual sessions, we're going to be using this book, The Anxious Generation, written by Jonathan Haidt. He is an American social psychologist. He has a Jewish background by heritage, so he brings some of that into his writing as well. He teaches in New York University as a professor. Later on in the book, he'll talk about, he teaches a course on human flourishing. When I went to UBC for my couple degrees, I don't think that kind of course was ever offered. But clearly, in this day and age, this is somewhat helpful for the young people who are going through young adulthood. And so this has been actually really cool to hear that there's courses on just human flourishing. How do we do that? And so he incorporates a lot of this material into his teaching. His claim to fame, I think, came when he wrote another book called Coddling of the American Mind. I know at Trinity Western University, it's been used as university textbooks. I'm sure other institutions have used it. Another book that he wrote a while ago is called The Righteous Mind, also became very famous. But I would say by far this one is probably making the most impact on our culture, especially in the education sector. I know my wife is a teacher in the Delta School District. I know that her colleagues are all talking about this or reading this. I know many of you who are educators are interested in this book. A lot of people have been talking about it. Now, you see here that this book was only published earlier this year, March 26. I read it because someone in our church asked me about this very topic. They had a child who was going into high school and didn't know what to do with the devices and social media and what do we do? And I'm like, I don't know. My kids are 8 and 3. I don't have much experience in this either. So he said he heard a book from Jonathan Haidt, and then I got it and I read it, and I thought it was great. And so I taught it at Camp Quanos in May, and then I taught it again at Sunnybray in August, and then here we are. This is my 3rd iteration. It usually gets better, so hopefully you're experiencing the upgraded version of this. But I think the book is fantastic. This class is not a replacement for reading the book. So disclaimer there. I think if you're interested in reading it, I think you still should, because we can't cover all of it. Another disclaimer. Some people said, should we put this in the church library? For now, I don't think so, only because this person isn't a Christ follower. He's an atheist, and we'll talk about that later. But not everything he says in this book we would morally and ethically agree with, which is fine, right? You don't have to read everything that you agree 100% on. So for now, we decided not to put it in our library, but it is a recommended read for sure, as long as you know that going in, okay? This book is actually a copy that I want to give away. So I like doing this whenever I teach classes. So whoever comes up to me after this class with the most enthusiasm right away will receive a free copy. This is how I buy your interest. But let's get on with the actual cultural exegesis. So for tonight, we're going to talk about this thing about anxiety. And Jonathan Haidt talks about it. Of course, it's in the title, The Anxious Generation. He talks about depression and other mental illnesses as well. So it's not just about anxiety. But we've learned as a church that this is a very important topic. Clearly, many of you were interested in it and signed up for this class. But not only this class, when we did a podcast episode with a clinical counselor Chelsea Conran. This episode was one of our most listened to episodes in our podcast. And another time we did an episode with Andrew Neufeld from Alongside You, and that was another episode that was super popular in our church podcast. So we understand that the community at large, not just churches and Christians, but a lot of people are interested in this topic. So that's one of the reasons why we wanted to cover it. And also, we're doing another class on November 30th, basic training, and we have about 50 people registered for that class. Dr. Josh Cruz used to be a pastor at Village Church for about 10 years. He always claims almost 10 years because I don't think he made it all the way to 10. And the lead pastor of Village is my brother-in-law. So I said, hey, can you just give him permission to say 10 years on his promotional materials instead of always saying almost 10 years? But he has a lot of experience. He went to Biola in California to study psychology, but also theology. So he has experience in both worlds. He's a registered psychologist. I think he'll be super helpful. And I know we know that there's a lot of interest in that as well. So for us, we wanted to talk about how Jonathan Haidt kind of claims that something important happened between 2010 and 2015-ish, and then it continues till now. And when he writes this book, he actually created a website that will go alongside it as almost like an appendix, but it's something that is constantly updated. So because it's in the format of a website, he continues to update it, and I'll show you the link in a bit here. And this is his evidence, because when he wrote the Coddling of the American Mind, other psychiatrists and other people in his industry spoke kind of saying, maybe you're overplaying how much impact social media, devices, technology, and all these things are impacting our next generation. And his focus will actually be on Generation Z or Gen Z. And he defines that as someone who was born 1996 or later. Okay, other sociologists will divide it differently. Some say 95, some say 97. For our purposes, somewhere around there, right? 96 and beyond. He actually claims there shouldn't be a distinction between Gen Z and Gen Alpha, because I'm sure many of you have already heard the next generation, they're naming it Alpha. They're going back. You know, we ran out of alphabet, Z, so like they're going back to Alpha. I'm assuming the next one will be Beta. That kind of would make sense. But he's saying there is actually not significant enough of a difference between the tendencies of Gen Z and Alpha. And therefore, he will use this term to include everyone who was born after 96. Okay, so just for us to clarify what he is saying when he says Gen Z. So here's the evidence that he's going to use to support his claims that there is a huge and very real impact on mental health. And most of this data is American, but we'll see some Canadian data as well. Can everyone see? I know we can't see the writing, but if you can see the general graph here, here's the evidence page. This is the appendix that I've been talking about. The youth mental health crisis, as he calls it. It starts in early 2010s. This is a statistic about major depressive episodes in the last year among U.S. teens aged between 12 to 17 years old. Now, this is a stat that has to do with self-reported episodes, right? These are people who self-reported that they had major depressive episodes. So you look at this and you see the range in boys here. There's no real movement, nothing significant at least until 2010, and then there's a slight bump, and then it continues here to 11.5%. But here's the challenge. In his book, he will make the notion that young girls are impacted way more by social media than young boys, at least currently as he has studied it. So here's the steady pacing of just stable increases here. And then you get 2010, 2011, and then it starts to rise dramatically. And then again, another spike recently till a point where we hit 30.1% just 3 years ago, right? And it came down a little bit, but not enough to say there's a substantial solution to this yet. Now, I want us to kind of take that in together as a group. You might challenge his data saying that this is self-reported data. Maybe it's not that reliable. Maybe younger generations have a tendency to say, I've had a major depressive episode, versus an older generation that's like, I had a bad day. And that could be somewhat true, right? So we have to take those things into account when we're looking at stats like this. So let's continue, because this isn't an isolated data here. So he writes that it is mostly internalizing disorders like anxiety and depression that we're noticing a rise in. So here it is, anxiety in the kind of turquoise graph here, and then orange here is depression. And I just want to kind of clarify what we mean by depression and anxiety. I am not a doctor or a psychologist, but from what I've read so far, I think anxiety disorder is defined by this idea that there's a sustained state of anxiety without a real justifiable cause, right? So all humans experience anxiety, right? Is that true? You guys experience, I hope you do. I experience anxiety all the time. It's actually good for us. Psychologists and doctors actually say it's important for our bodies to have this. So our brain, the way that Haidt explains it is, our brain is capable to detect threat and respond to it faster than our eyes can see something and relay the information to our brain, okay? So just think about that. This is why we experience this all the time. This is why when a car comes and it almost hits you, you jump out of the way and then you assess, oh, what just happened? You don't normally go, oh, there's a car coming. I shall move aside. No, we don't do that, right? We react first. Our bodies are created so that we can actually survive some of these threats by being hyper alert and able to, in a very quick way, without even us being able to process it in our mind, to react. Imagine a firefighter walking into a house to rescue someone the house is burning down, and you're trying to go and rescue someone in the house. They are heightened in that state, right? Your heartbeat shouldn't be the same as when you're having coffee with your friend at Starbucks. So there's this heightened state that makes sense. It makes sense that this firefighter is experiencing this tense state where he's quickly able to respond to threats. However, if that state of anxiety sustains, even when you're just having coffee with a friend that is actually not a threat to you whatsoever, but that anxiety won't go away, that's what we're talking about when we say anxiety disorder. Okay, I also wanted to kind of do a disclaimer here that I think we should be very sensitive to the fact that there are people probably in this room, most likely statistically, that suffer with anxiety disorder. And so we don't want to say, and Jonathan Haidt isn't saying that we can just do better, we can read this book and it'll all go away. Right? We recognize that there's lots of factors in here. I think there's lots of things that we're going to study over the next 4 weeks that will help us deal with anxiety, even anxiety disorder. But we're not saying that this book will solve everything. I think what it will do is it'll help us understand what's happening perhaps a little bit better. I also, actually, let's go through some of the stats again. Here it says it hits younger people more than older people. Gen Z, harder than any other generation. Look at this. We're going to do ages later. So if you're comfortable about, raising your hands to show us what age group you belong in, you can do that. 18 to 25, you see it here, 2022, January, it's almost 20% reported anxiety prevalence. And here, 26 to 34, 12.28. Oh, here's Pastor Jordan, 7.54. And look at that. Look at y'all, 50 plus. Y'all are doing great. Remember what I said on Sunday? If you're doing great, what's your role? You're supposed to come alongside others and help. So for those of us who are not experiencing anxiety and major depressive disorder, this is our opportunity not to say, look at that, I've avoided that, that's great. No, it's our opportunity to pay attention to what's going on in our society, in our younger generation, come alongside and help. I wrote this in the Optimist. The Holy Spirit in Greek is parakletos, paraclete. It means one who responds to the call of someone in need, right? And another Greek word, boethos, used as a helper in the New Testament, that word means one who runs to the aid of someone in need, right? This is our Holy Spirit. This is what he does. And for those of us who believe that we are made in our God's image, it is our role and opportunity to serve others in this way, especially knowing that depression and anxiety is prevalent in our society. So that's the age breakdown, but it's not just self-reported data. Remember I said if it's just self-reported data, you might have an opportunity to challenge this. Yes, Johnny?
I was just questioned on that last graph there. My curiosity came from, that was to do with anxiety, but I was curious on the anxiety part. Could that have anything to do with having a more solid identity in yourself? Because as I found as I've gotten older, my identity is now much more solid than, say, when I was 16, is still very moldable, and
Yep.
I was a lot more caring about pleasing my peers. Like there's the old quote of, when you're 20, you care what everybody thinks about you. 40, you stop caring. And 60, you realize nobody cared in the first place.
Yes, yes, absolutely. And that's a very good point, Johnny, and very insightful, because Jonathan Haidt would also go on to talk about this. He'll mention that as we mature, we care less. Generally, we care less of what people think around us. And that's why social media has a bigger impact on our younger generations, especially younger girls. Apparently, statistically, they're more prone to caring about what others think of them, at least here in North America. However, even though that's true that as we mature, that we will be able to better fend off these kind of off-ramp temptations and these pitfalls, it's not enough to say let's wait until they mature, because the next stats that we'll show is it's not just self-reported data, it's also behavioral data like self-harm and suicide. Look at the increase. This is rates per 100,000 in America, okay? You look at 2005 to 2010, there is nominal change and stability, and then you go up 2010. Why is it that everything happened around 2010? Right? This is when social media wasn't invented in 2010, but the like button, the front-facing camera, right? All these strengthening of comparisons with others, this pressure to perform and put on like the best life or else you're a loser, that kind of mentality came in with some advancements in technology. Some might call it advancements, some might call it some downfalls of really like the like button, the follower numbers, the influencer lifestyle. All of that started here and only gotten more aggressive. And look at that rise and hike. This is why our society can't just say, let's wait until they mature and they'll grow out of it, because right now this is, I think most of us would agree, unacceptable. We need to do something. And you'll notice that for boys it's a lot less, but even then the trend does continue here. The rise here is so much more significant than the stability back in 2005. U.S. adolescent girls hospitalized for self-harm ages 10 to 14. Look at the rise between the ages 10 to 14. It impacts them perhaps more than anyone else. U.S. female emergency department visits for self-harm. Do you notice the difference? Ages 20 to 24, 25 to 29, it stabilizes. To Johnny's point, it makes sense as maturation happens. We stabilize, but the vulnerable population here, ages 10 to 19 especially, something needs to be done. The story for boys becomes clearer when we turn to suicide, because we see the rise in spikes of suicide rates as well for boys. A lot less significant than girls, but still problematic. Now, you can access all of this data, but I just wanted to point out this last one because I don't want us to think this is just American stats, because unfortunately the trend continues. In just around early 2010s, it happens in UK as well, among girls more than boys. Same here in Ontario, so this is some Canadian stats now. Again, there's actually a dip happening from 2004 to 2010, and when we hit 2010, we see a pretty substantial climb to the point where we are a lot higher in Canada as well. And again, more girls than boys. So this is not just an American or North American phenomenon. I don't have data for like Asian countries, but when I was talking to our two Korean friends here in the room, they were saying they imagine this is probably even worse in Korea, if not the same. So I think this is a problem that's too broad and too internationally impacting that we can't just say this has nothing to do with social media or the technological advancements. I think the timeline is too consistent, and therefore he calls it the evidence that we ought to look at and we need to do something about. Now, here's another disclaimer. Tonight will be a lot of disclaimers, okay? We don't want to say as a church that all social media usage is bad. Okay, we believe that, for example, money is good. And yet, could we use money in a very corrupt way to harm ourselves? Absolutely. Right? It's similar to social media usage. Not all social media usage is bad. If we really believe that, we wouldn't have an Instagram and Facebook account of our own, and we have a YouTube account as well. I literally told you we're going to put this on YouTube. We don't care about the number of followers, other than we need a certain number of followers to access some privileges on YouTube. So if you haven't subscribed, go ahead and subscribe. But you see, this is what I mean. Even while we're talking about the pitfalls of social media, many of us use it. How many of you actively use social media? Right? No shame, no guilt, right? It can be a tool. It can be a great tool. My grandparents always used to just look at my Facebook or Instagram just to catch up on what our kids are doing. They love seeing the photos there. FaceTime, it's amazing, right? Facebook Messenger could be really good. So we just want to say that social media usage isn't always bad, but research does show that the dangers of social media must be made aware of. Remember back in the days, and I'm saying remember because some of you remember, I don't remember. Back in the days when the technology of the car, the automobile, became mainstream, and seatbelts weren't a mandatory thing, right? Haidt talks about this where he goes, later we learned through statistics and evidence like this, after years have gone by, oh wow, we should probably enforce this rule about seatbelts because too many people are dying in accidents or getting severely injured because the lack of seatbelt usage. As long as it's made optional, most people will choose not to wear it. That was the statistic at the time. So what did they do? They enforced it by law. Jonathan Haidt's thing is, we're talking about politics, we got lots of elections coming up. I don't think he really cares about our political leanings. He's saying at some point, though, as a society, we govern what younger generations especially can and cannot do. You're allowed to smoke, you're allowed to drink, fine. But you can't buy it legally under the age of 19, at least in our country, 21 in the States. Right? So we do determine this. Even the legal age of driving, we determine these things in other parts of our society. Jonathan Haidt is trying to bring attention, or bring our attention to this idea that maybe there has been too little regulation on social media platforms, and these multi-billion or even trillion-dollar companies, these tech companies, have been able to just do free-for-all. Now again, I know some of us work in tech industries. I'm not saying all of y'all are bad, not at all. But I do think this is something interesting for us to talk about. If we know that this is harming our kids and our grandkids a lot, then maybe we should do something about it. Delta School District, for the first time this year, said devices cannot come to school. Right? So we're starting to see some changes. I know Ontario did the same thing. I know many states in America are talking about or have done the same thing. So I think there's enough evidence to say there needs to be some sort of action, but I also want to say that I don't want to stand here and say that this isn't a challenge for me. And I don't want us to just guilt or blame people who rely on social media maybe too heavily. So I want to give you a little bit of my background, my story. We had our child 8 years ago with Nathan, and things were kind of difficult. My mother-in-law was diagnosed with terminal cancer 1 month after we had our baby. He was our first child. If you guys have had children, you know how hectic it is anyway to become a parent and try to learn the ropes. But we also had to be caregiver to our mother-in-law who was dying, and we're a very tight-knit family, so we were there for the ride for the next 18 months, right? So think about that. And I thought, you know what? My life isn't full yet. I need to add one more thing. So I applied for this job, and I became lead pastor in 2017 when all of this was happening. So I was transitioning, and we thought that wasn't enough, so we moved twice that year, right? So it was like Nathan was going to daycare and babysitting in 7 different places every week, right? I think it was 5 different cities he was going to. We're dropping off everywhere we can. And that was the norm. It was chaotic. Christiane comes around, very different experience. My daughter, who's only 3 now, she was born in COVID times, right? So then a completely different story. I'm at home, present with her every single day, probably too much. Radical difference in our children's behaviors and tendencies. But here's the thing. Because we were so busy for both children, we started to rely on YouTube and Netflix to give them shows. You know, if you haven't tried it, if you haven't parented during the age of technology like this, man, it's like magic. They stop crying, and you could keep them quiet for hours. I know you guys had some hard stuff too. You guys used to give alcohol-based stuff to children. Later you learned, oh, maybe that wasn't a good idea. This is our generation's challenge. It's so tempting. This is why I don't want to like make people feel ashamed if you've used this. I'm coming out and saying Sarah and I have used YouTube and all these things to try to make parenting easier and to manage, okay? But we've started to notice a dramatic change in both of our children's behavior, so we had to cut it out. We started reading things like this. Sarah didn't read it. She delegated that part to me. We read, and I was like, okay, we got to change. I started nagging my wife to get on board, and we got on board. She agreed right away with the premise of it, but it was harder in practice. This is where it hits, right? Sarah goes, oh, this is going on YouTube maybe. Okay, well, Sarah goes, well, you're not home. You're out teaching these classes, doing board meetings. You're out every evening. I'm home with the 2 kids. I work full-time. I got to cook, clean, and do all of this while you're out doing your amazingly fun board meetings. So, like, it's hard when I'm trying to ask her, can we tone it down with the devices? So I want us to come to this with, like, an attitude of humility and grace towards each other rather than guilt and shame. And to anyone else, if you're grandparents and you see your children parenting in this way, and you just want to take that phone away, be patient, be gracious. Let's do it in God-honoring, loving ways, okay? But I do think, even though we don't want to guilt anyone and shame anyone, I think it's important to share the information as fact and data and allow us to make decisions in a more informed way. When we realized that cars without seatbelts wasn't a good idea, we did something about it. So when we were informed, from 2010, we've now had 14 years. We've had a whole generation of kids, unfortunately, that went through this entirely. Their entire childhood was lived through this. Now we're informed. So for us to do nothing about it as a culture, as a church, as a society, there's a problem there. Okay? All right. So now we're finally going to get into the meat of it. Anxious generation, exegeting our culture. Jonathan Haidt will bring 2 significant factors when we're talking about why all of this happened in 2010. We talked about the front-facing camera. We talked about all the advancements. But there's going to be 2 significant factors that he's going to talk about. One is this play-based childhood versus phone-based childhood idea. Okay? He says all children, sociologically, psychologically, all children need childhood to thrive in life. Childhood is actually a very intentional part of God's design for us. But even scientifically, our brain develops in a very different manner when we're at that age versus now. This is why language acquisition is so much easier. Like Ella here, she'll learn English much faster than Amy. I'm sorry, Amy. I'll give you some hope. You can still do it, but you'll never catch up to the speed that Ella can do it in. Right? We're just different. That season of life was designed for us to use it to grow and develop. What Haidt is arguing here is that play-based childhood allows you to do that. This is why First Steps Preschool, did you see our tagline? Safe, loving, and what? Fun. Fun is actually a super important ingredient. Now, we have lots of educators, lots of people in healthcare. Do you guys agree that fun, community, being with each other, socializing is an incredibly important part of our development? He's saying what phone-based childhood did to us is it isolated children. Rather than fun-based, play-based childhood, our children largely grew up in a phone-based childhood. We'll get to some of the problems with this, but he's going to name 4 things that are different between real relationships and virtual relationships. Yes, sir.
What about work-based childhood? That's missing.
Yep.
Now, it's not play.
Yep.
It's work-based. But
Yes.
It's something quite different than both play-based and phone-based.
Yes. He'll get to that.
Okay.
We'll get to that. And kind of similar to what I talked about yesterday in my sermon, for those of you who were here, I talked about putting Nathan to work to set up all those hats and napkins in the gym. Yeah, he will talk about that. That's absolutely helpful, right? But the phone-based childhood actually, we'll get to that later, because it actually comes out later tonight too, okay? So hang tight. So Jonathan Haidt defines real relationships in these 4 categories. He says, the real relationships are embodied, meaning that we use our bodies to communicate. We're conscious of our body or of the bodies of others, and we respond to the bodies of others both consciously and unconsciously. Gestures and all that stuff. Bodily experience of one another is super important. Now, just another caveat here. This is the most content-heavy session. It will be a lot more interactive rest of the way, but this is kind of laying a foundation for all the other sessions that we're going to go through. Johnny.
My question was, I was just curious, thinking that, so I come up in this generation he speaks of, and I'm curious, does he draw a difference between in like staring at the phone and watching something mindless on YouTube compared to, say, online gaming? Like, I'm wondering, does he separate the two, or does he lump them together?
No, he separates it all. It's quite detailed, and we'll get to that as well. Thank you. Good questions here. There we go. Sorry, my slides are lagging just slightly. There we go. Okay, number 2. So it's embodied. Bodily experience is important. And secondly, real relationships are synchronous, meaning they are happening at the same time with subtle cues about timing and turn-taking. Like we did that just now, right? Between me and Johnny, me and Gerard. We have these social cues for appropriate turn-taking. Now, are children good at this? No. How many times do we have to tell our children, it's not your turn to talk yet. Mommy and daddy are talking right now, right? Naturally, children need to learn this, okay? They don't just grow up knowing this. So taking this away causes them to not be able to learn some very fundamental social skills. Real relationships involve primarily one-to-one or one-to-several communication with only one interaction happening at any given moment. Like here, if you all decide to do free-for-all and talk to each other instead of listening or talking one person at a time, this will be a problem, right? But in the virtual world, we'll see later, the one-to-several communication happens all the time. Number 4. Real relationships take place within communities that have a high bar for entry and exit, so people are strongly motivated to invest in relationships and repair rifts when they happen. So what this means is that because real relationships take time, and you need to invest a lot of energy, time, and effort into building these, when there is a disagreement or when there is an episode between me and a friend, or maybe parent and child, you try to fix it because you understand the effort needed to build new relationships is a lot. But let's see the difference in virtual relationships. This is what Jonathan Haidt indicates about virtual relationships. They are, first of all, disembodied, meaning that no body is needed, just language. Partners could be, and already are, artificial intelligences. He later talks about this idea of a Karen bot that boys use, and Johnny talked about distinctions. He makes a distinction with boys using Karen bot and video gaming to escape the reality of this world. So many boys are like so afraid and anxious about asking a girl out on a date that they have turned to this AI bot that will flirt with them because the fear of rejection causes them to turn away from asking a girl out on a date. Right? So this is kind of prevalent in his research, and anecdotally, you might have seen some of this. Partners could be, and already are, artificial intelligences. They believe that relationships do not need to be embodied. They're heavily asynchronous, not synchronous, happening via text-based posts and comments. Think about all the social media and all that stuff. A video call is different, though. He'll categorize video calling as a separate thing because video calling is synchronous. When you're FaceTiming your grandparents in New Zealand, you are doing it in an asynchronous manner. Now, still, embodied relationship would be better, but it's not the same as just texting back and forth or emailing is the distinction he's making, okay? Okay, here it is. And virtual relationships involve a substantial number of one-to-many communications, broadcasting to a potentially vast audience. Multiple interactions can be happening in parallel. Now, I said one of the things that we're going to talk about in the next sessions is being focused, right? Virtual relationships cause our children to learn a way of relating to humans that is not focused or present. And that is a huge thing that we're going to get into in the next several weeks. Okay, we were meant to be present with one another. Now, a simple technology like a TV could distract us from this, right? How many stories have you heard from like a wife or a husband trying to say something very important and the other spouse is watching TV and boom, you're not listening? This happened literally yesterday at my house. All it takes is a TV. We don't even need advanced technology like a smartphone. But a TV was, let's say, this much distracting guess how much a smartphone would be? Right? So we are getting used to distracted and non-present conversations. And it's a problem. It's a problem. This is not just a problem for the young people. If we're brave enough to admit it, this is a problem for us too. Okay, virtual relationships take place within communities that have a low bar for entry and exit, so people can block others or just quit when they're not pleased. Communities tend to be short-lived, and relationships are often disposable. What are some of the phrases that we use? Ghosting each other, right? We can do this. Virtually, it's easy. I'm not going to see you anyway. It doesn't hurt. I just log out, and it's done. But here at South Delta Baptist Church, you log out of our church, you'll see me at Thrifty's. You try to go to Walmart, I'm going there too. It's going to be hard, right? Small town especially. It's a lot harder to just log out of relationships in real relationships compared to virtual relationships. So here it is, summing it up. Real world relationships are embodied, synchronous, one interaction at a time, high bar for entry and exit, forces us to be present and focused, or else the relationship just falls apart. Virtual relationships are disembodied, asynchronous. You expect multiple interactions at a time. You expect distractedness. You expect and accept non-presence. There's a low bar for entry and exit. Here are the challenges. Now, the younger generation who grew up entirely in this kind of mode, it is difficult for them to tell apart between what's real and what is not real. So here it is. Generative fill in Photoshop. Many of you know that I love photography, so I use Photoshop from time to time to edit my photos. And here's the thing. That picture on the left is the real picture. It's a portrait, orientation, like vertical, and that was the photo. But guess what? Photoshop does this. It's called generative fill. It generates the parts that a computer thinks should complete the picture. So even if you didn't take this vantage point of a picture, on a click of a button, and depending on how fast your computer is, and maybe a few minutes later, boom, voila. This wonderfully amazing picture appears, and you can pretend that you're an amazing photographer. Do you think you can tell apart? If I didn't tell you that, would you think that that photo is fake? It's difficult. It's so difficult that Meta, I think the organization that owns Facebook and Instagram and all those guys, they're trying to make it a rule to say if you've tampered with the image, a certain percentage of the image was not actually taken by you, but it was edited later or filled in with generative AI, you have to report it. There'll be an icon showing you this was not an original image taken by this person. It doesn't belong to them. Right? There's a lot of ethical questions that we won't get into tonight. But one of the things I wanted to talk about, is that telling apart from what's real and what's fake has become harder and harder as technology has advanced. How many of you have that call blocking feature because there's so many scam phone calls? Right? It's difficult. And who do they target? Usually seniors. My poor grandma, who's 98, thinks the world is free. Everyone's offering free things to her all the time. But it's which two generations do you think will be the most susceptible to this idea of having a hard time differentiating what's real and not real? On both ends of the age spectrum. The seniors and the children. And this is why maybe there is an obligation in society for us to protect people who aren't able to detect reality and what's not real. In relationships, perhaps this is happening in real time, and we need to do something about it. I want to show you a quote from Jonathan Haidt's book, and I think this is fantastic. He says, there's a strange fact about human development. Here's a strange fact about human beings. Our kids grow fast, and then slow, and then fast. If you plot human growth curves against those of chimpanzees, you see that chimps grow at a steady pace until they reach sexual maturity, at which point they reproduce, right? That's their goal. They do it. It's steady. It's consistent. Boom, done. But human children wait. They grow rapidly for the first 2 years, and then they slow down for the next 7 to 10, and then undergo a rapid growth spurt during puberty before coming to a halt a few years later. Intriguingly, a child's brain is already 90% of its full size by around age 5. So think about it, right? And he talks about it in more of an evolutionary kind of a context too. And he goes like, think about it. If you believe in evolutionary science, then wait. You get a child with a giant head, with a giant brain, right? Almost 90% full already, and you're running around in like tiny bodies. It's not good. Why do humans do that? No other animal really does this, right? Why do humans do that? Because humans are the only ones that need to download, kind of like Matrix, I guess, but we need to download so much information about cultural norms, wisdom, not just knowledge. And that takes time. That takes time to learn, develop, absorb, experience. This is why our culture values experience. Right? That doesn't happen without time. You need to give children time. When I first took this job, I was 30, was I 30, 31? Something like that. And the biggest concern of our church, I think at the time, was that I was young. And I said, I will guarantee you I will fix that. I will get older. But you guys needed to be extra gracious and patient with me, and still do need to be extra patient and gracious with me because I'm still very young. What was that? Just to note, I am the youngest pastor on staff in our church. Anyways, no, but it's funny that we give grace when we know, okay, this person clearly hadn't gone through everything, so we naturally give grace to that person. It's like that with children. Can you imagine if my 8-year-old son, Nathan, looked like a 50-year-old? Then we would be like, dude, what are you doing? What are you doing right now? You got to learn things about turn-taking. You got to stop binge-watching Netflix. You should have self-control, right? But when we know that he's a child, our expectations change, and the latitude he has in which he can safely learn and grow and develop, it's huge. It's necessary. And this is the problem that he brings to our attention. When we rob that from our children, it's a problem. He said, I think I have an next slide. He says here, human childhood is extended to give children time to learn. A phone-based childhood robs children of this opportunity to learn. We need children to be children, right? We need to give them time and space for that. And a phone-based childhood had inadvertently robbed that from them. The second significant factor that Haidt talks about in his book is the pitfalls of being overprotective in the real world and underprotective in the virtual world. He talks about this idea of being overprotective in the real world, and he says, even though in North America, now he's talking specifically to USA and Canada right now, okay? So in our two countries at least, statistically, our crime rates have significantly decreased in most cities. In most cities, it's become safer than ever physically in our physical world, okay? However, our protection of our children and our fear and anxiety of what they're allowed to do at a certain age has become a lot worse. On the other side, though, in the online world, because let's admit it, most of us don't get that world as much as our children's age. Like my 3-year-old could navigate the iPad perfectly. No, I'm not even kidding, right? It's scary. When I was 3, like what did we do? Like, we play with dirt. Like honestly, like iPad, what? We see these children, they're able to navigate sometimes and oftentimes, especially when they hit their teenage years, much better than their parents. Their parents have no knowledge in this world, in this realm. So then what do parents do? Okay, your school says you need your laptop for your homework, go for it. Underprotected. Now, I'm not saying everyone does that. I know many parents are very aware and very involved, but this is where video game addiction and porn addiction for boys have become a big issue, and social media addiction for girls have become a big issue. under-supervised, under-protected in the virtual world. But let's get back to the overprotected in the real world part. Now, Jonathan Haidt says he does this every time he goes to speak somewhere so that he gets anecdotal data as well. So I'm going to do this with you guys. I've done this in several settings. Let's talk about age of liberation. Okay, he calls it age of liberation. What it means is the time, at the age in which you were allowed to go to your cousin's house, your friend's house alone, or with an older sibling or a cousin. Not with an adult, not with a grown-up, but let's say, you know, a cousin who's like 2 or 3 years older than you. When were you allowed to go, let's say, not just 2 houses down, we don't count that. And I know many of you have been raised in the mean streets of Tawasin and Ladner, and I grew up in like Atlanta, and so maybe you guys were like way more sheltered, but let's try this. For those of you who were born in 65 through 80, what some people would call Generation X, the sandwich generation. Yay. Yeah, y'all are paying for everyone's bills. Gen X, let's see, you can shout it out if you want. What was your age of liberation where you were allowed to do this? 8? Proud Gen Xers here. 8 to 10, okay. Anyone else? Hey, don't pretend. No. Let's say a 10-minute walk. Let's say a 10-minute walk. 7? 5? Wow, there you go. Grade 3, grade 2, okay. And I recognize this also depends on what city you grew up in and what kind of context you had at home. Totally, right? Richmond, yes, Richmond, that makes sense. How about those of you who were born from 46 to 64? The boomers. 46 to 64. I'm looking at you guys, so let's go for it. What age? 5, 6? 5? Okay. And Gerard, was that a farm setting? Richmond, okay. Awesome. Yeah, Pastor Jason and I did this. Pastor Jason's from Ontario, from a farm, and he says, yeah, he was allowed to bike to his cousin's places at that early age. And when you live in farms, you're not close. There's no phone to track where you are. Location tracking did not exist, right? You really just kind of had to let them go. How about, do we have 28 to 45, the silent generation? Well, they're going to be silent, clearly, but I don't know why you're called the silent generation, but you are. 28 to 45, anyone in the house, 28 to 45? 4 or 5. Wow, do you see the difference here? Millennials in the house? Okay, wow, like last year, we left the house last year. And someone drove us here because of, obviously, like, I'm just kidding. Any Gen Zers in the house? Yes, proud Gen Zers. Okay, what age do you think? You have mom to corroborate? 14. Okay. Age 8, okay. So let me read you some anecdotal stats from Jonathan Haidt, okay? And I've done this in several settings, and this is very consistent. This room is very consistent to what I experience in other rooms, okay? Jonathan Haidt says, first, I ask everyone who was born before 1981 to raise their hands. These are the members of the Gen X born from 65 to 80, and the baby boomers, 46 to 64, and the last members of the so-called silent generation, 28 to 45. I asked these older audience members to recall their age of liberation privately, and then to shout it out when I point to their section of the room. Nearly everyone shouts out 6, 7, or 8, which was kind of close. We had some 4s and 5s as well, right? And it sometimes is hard for me to continue the demonstration because they're laughing and fondly recounting to each other the grand adventures they used to have with the other kids in their neighborhood. Next, I ask everyone who was born in 1996 or later, Gen Z, to raise their hands. When I ask them to shout out their liberation age, the difference is stark. The majority fall between 10 and 12 with just a few 8s, 9s, and 13s, and 14s. Members of the millennial generation fall in between and show a wide range of liberation ages. Now, in Korea, Lisu and Ryan, you can. So I was born in Seoul, Korea. There's about 1 million people on your block, so it's very difficult to do any kind of serious crime when 1 million people are there. So I walked to school, well, I think it was preschool, but I walked to preschool when I was like probably like 4, right? But it is a totally different context. CCTV cameras are everywhere, including your classrooms. Can you imagine, teachers? Every classroom has a CCTV camera that their parents can log into right now. Whew! All of y'all are quitting. So it depends on the context, we admit that. But generally speaking, we have become way less willing to allow our children to play independently. And he's saying this has actually changed and shaped the way our children think of this world. We've taught them, I don't think intentionally, but we've taught them that this world is dangerous and shouldn't be trusted. To a certain extent, that's true. I understand that. But perhaps overly so. Hold on a second. To the point where I think, and this is me speaking, not Jonathan Haidt, because Jonathan Haidt is an American male, Caucasian. I do think a lot of our younger generation or at least I think the modeling that we've done as a society is that older white males are not to be trusted. I do think that, and I feel like I can say this about people and get away with it maybe, but this has become a challenge. In the playground, how many of you who fall into that category feel like you can go to a 3-year-old, 4-year-old girl and start talking to her without being accused of being inappropriate? Right? When I was growing up, that was completely acceptable. If there was a fight happening in the playground, anyone was allowed to engage, and any adult was allowed to come and try to settle things when the kids are fighting. Nowadays, even I find myself second guessing, can I interact with this stranger's child and even like kind of rebuke him or her? Is that allowed in our society? Johnny.
I was just going to ask this because my mom's talked to me about it a fair bit, about like about different ages of liberation and stuff, and she said the biggest difference, she said, between her, and she's Gen X, and me, she said, is the creation of the 24-hour news cycle. She said the reason all of the helicopter parents came out with you kids is because there were a number of one to like a couple of high number profile child kidnappings that sent all the parental groups into a panic attack that basically have been locking up their children, even though the people who got kidnapped were 10 states over, and it was like all.
Yeah, I think exposure for sure is way more in real time and also more frequent, right? I don't think that's the only factor though. And here I'm timing myself, and we're running out of time, so I will go through this last part quickly. But I do think this has become like a very problematic area, coupled with the devices. It's not only the devices that Jonathan Haidt talks about. This idea that we have created an anxious presence among our kids. So it's not just our kids' problem. It's not their fault. Who put the devices in their hands in the first place? It's us. Who created this overly anxious response to the dangers of the world? It was us. And so this isn't in the book, but my response to this biblically, I think, is that we need to recapture a non-anxious presence with our world. And I don't mean this, like, again, if you have anxiety disorder, I'm not saying you can't contribute to this. We all can in our own given context. And I think we need each other as a church community to do this really well, too. But a non-anxious presence is not a phrase that I have coined. You may, for those of you who are younger, you may have heard this used by John Mark Comer. He uses it all the time whenever he speaks, the non-anxious presence. But it actually doesn't belong to him. He credits someone else to it. Edwin Friedman was a Jewish rabbi and I believe a psychologist. And he wrote, this book was published after he died posthumously, but it's called A Failure of Nerve. And in this book, he coins the term non-anxious presence. The world is filled with anxiety. Us contributing to more anxiety doesn't help. Us asking our children to panic because we are panicking all the time over little and big things doesn't help. Because guess what? Scientifically, children, but not only children, all humans pick up what other people are doing, and we mimic them, especially when you're in this development stage. This is called a mirror neuron. I've used this in my sermon a couple times already, but if my slide will advance. Nope, lost connection again. Do you mind advancing the slide there, Richard? Oh, never mind, I got it. Okay, here's the National Institute of Health, and this is what they report about mirror neurons. Mirror neurons are one of the most important discoveries in the last decade of neuroscience. These are a variety of visuospatial neurons which indicate fundamentally about human social interaction. Next slide, please. Essentially, mirror neurons respond to actions that we observe in others. The interesting part is that mirror neurons fire in the same way when we actually recreate that action ourselves. So when they did this with chimpanzees, and they gave one chimp a banana, and the other chimp wasn't eating the banana, the same neurons would fire up in the chimp that wasn't actually eating it. This is what mirror neurons do. Defects in the mirror neuron system are being linked to disorders like autism. This review is a brief introduction to the neurons that shaped our civilization. This is not an understatement. For them, mirror neurons are significant in our culture and in the way that we operate. So when we bring an anxious presence to our children and to our next generation, guess what they're going to mimic? Anxiety. Now, I'm not saying that's the only single factor that's contributing to the anxious generation, but I think this is an important one that we can start to address today. Everyone else, other than Ella, we're all grown-ups here. We have an opportunity to be mindful of this idea that we can offer a non-anxious presence to this world. I do this with my child. I've shared it with our church many times, but I do this thing called square breathing. I was taught this by our psychologist, and this is really helpful when my son suffers with anxiety. And when he has anxiety attacks, when he's really at the height of it and he's like screaming, I give him a hug. And then I try to calm him down by asking him to do breathing exercises. Now we've done it many times, so it helps him even more quickly. The Navy SEAL, the U.S. Navy SEAL uses this as their tactic when they're in this like massively stressful life and death situation. They use square breathing to calm their heart down. So this is like a scientific approach. When I do it, I don't ask him to do it. We do it together. When I do it, the mirror neuron kicks in. Me coming down a couple notches in calmness through the breathing exercise physiologically impacts my son who is watching and doing it together. So it's a lot more helpful. When I used to do Tsawwassen First Nation ministry, I was serving a particular part of that group that were struggling with financial stuff. And so we did like a food bank program, and we used to cook them dinner every Sunday. At first, I didn't want to waste all the energy that our church people used to cook this meal on volunteers. We could eat at home. So I just placed the meal on the table, and we just watched while they ate. And they said that was highly uncomfortable. We're not friends. We're just your subject matter. So guess what? We learned very quickly, in order for us to be real friends, we needed to sit down together and eat. See, this is kind of a good illustration of how mirror neurons work. Together, always more helpful. You do this. Get better. Toughen up. Not helpful. Can I sit with you in your anxiety? I don't fully understand what you're going through, but I'm going to sit here with you. Can I listen? Can I just sit here? If you don't want me to talk, I can just be present. You think that's a waste of time for some of you, maybe. But scientifically and biblically, there's opportunity for us to see that that actually is helpful. People in our culture feel often overwhelmed. That's why we see trends even in the theological world of John Mark Comer, Tyler Staton, Pete Scazzero, Dallas Willard, and many other people in the last decades continue to talk about this idea of non-anxious presence, that we need to have a slow discipleship, slow down, and be present. Be present with God and one another.
I'm thinking of a verse. Tell me if this is a mirror neuron. A soft answer turneth away wrath. Is that a biblical example of mirror?
I think so, and I think we'll have an opportunity to explore that in the coming weeks. But I want to give you a different verse as we end, and I think this one is quite popular among Christians. But here, come to me, all who labor and are heavy laden, and I'll give you rest. What does Jesus say? I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you, i.e., mirror me, and learn from me, for I am gentle and lowly in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy and my burden is light. And if you've ever heard a sermon on this, you've heard that this doesn't mean life is easy. It does not mean you will have rosy colored, like everything will not be great. There will be persecution, Jesus says. But he says, I'm going to sit here with you, present in your life, in a very real relationship. I will hold your hand through this. I will not abandon you as orphans. He is offering us his presence as the gift. Here's a picture of a yoke that was used perhaps in those days. This yoke here is an interesting device. I'm not a farmer. I said that last Sunday, but here's what Christianity.com says about this. Essentially, a yoke was a harness used by oxen and other animals to ease the work of hauling a load. We think the yoke is a burden that Jesus puts on us, but no, its whole point was to ease the load. This is why he commands us to Sabbath, which we'll talk about in the coming weeks. It was also meant as a designation of what? Servitude and carrying the burden of task and mission. So he's not saying there's no more task for you, there's no more mission for you, going back to the theology of work. He's not saying you just sit here and don't do anything because you're anxious. You just stay here and just do the square breathing all the time and calm down. No, that scientifically and spiritually doesn't help. Jesus is going to still invite you to his amazing work, to partner with him. But he says you will never be asked to do that without me. What does he promise? Go and make disciples of all nations. But what does he promise after that? For behold, I am with you always to the end of the age. Our Lord, the perfect example of a non-anxious presence. When the storm arose and the disciples were going wild, what does he say? Fear not, for I'm with you. That's the gift. And that is the gift that we can give one another. This is the one thing we can do today, to learn to be more present, more focused, and more rested as Christ followers, to run to the aid of people who are in need. And at times, that's us. We need help. And that's okay. Be part of a community that will invest in being present, focused, and rested Christ followers. Next week, we're going to talk about biblical response, being present. That's the first thing we're going to tackle. I know this was a lot. I promise you, the next session is also a lot. But the last two, way more interactive, all right? Way more interactive, way more room for you to speak into it. But I hope this sets a good foundation for the rest of the things that we're going to talk about in the coming weeks. Any questions or comments before we close tonight? Is this helpful? Okay, all right, thank you. We'll see you next week.